Great to be back tonight. As I said last week, we're getting close to the end of our study through the life of Christ, and so I want to spend sometimes these work. Just click on it somewhere, Dawn, and it should go. Spend a little bit of time when I'm able to be up here to be able to continue our lessons, since we're not going through all of them except for on Sunday morning Bible class. So this morning, we talked about Judas betraying Jesus and what happened all during that. And so now we're going to see what happens right after that. So the final week, we're on Friday, the Jewish trials and Peter's denials. I don't think they rhymed that on purpose, but it worked. We'll mainly be in Matthew, John, and Luke. So we'll flip around to get sections from each of them just to kind of get the whole picture of everything. But if you remember from our study this morning, Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was lifting supplications to the Father. He was spending the time just doing the things he needed to get prepared. And then the mob came, and Judas betrayed Jesus, and Jesus was arrested. So we're here right after that. We're getting ready to talk about the Jewish trial. It's not much of a trial. There's not a whole lot going back and forth, but the Jewish leaders for a long time now have been trying to find a way to frame Jesus, a way to find him guilty of something so that they can feel better about themselves, about their decisions that they're about to make because of all this. So we'll look at stage 1 starting out. So we'll start out in John chapter 18. John chapter 18, starting in verse 12. Says, "So the Roman cohort and the commander of the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him, and led him to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. Now Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was expedient for one man to die on behalf of the people." So let's stop there in the story. We're figuring out who everybody is, kind of getting a context of it. So who was Annas? He was the father-in-law of Caiaphas. He was the high priest, and the book says that he was the high priest between 6 and 15 AD. As it says, the office of the high priest was a lifetime position, so he would have it his whole life, but he was removed from office by the Roman procurator, Valerius Gratus. So it was a lifetime position, but he was removed from it. So why take it? Why take Jesus to him? He was still probably considered really high ranking. He had been the high priest, and some people still considered him the rightful high priest, even though he was no longer technically in that office. But it's still not 100% clear why the mob took Jesus to Annas first, but maybe he had requested it. Maybe he had said, hey, once you finally get this guy, bring him to me, we'll deal with him. Maybe the people had thought that they were out of ideas, out of options of ways to try to frame Jesus, and thought, well, maybe Annas will know an idea and something that we can do to frame him. Or maybe they were just buying time until the Sanhedrin could gather and, do whatever the Sanhedrin does in this situation. So we move on, verses 13 and 14, like we just read. So we find out that Annas was the father-in-law of Caiaphas. Then in verse 14, now Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was expedient for one man to die on behalf of the people. So Caiaphas was the actual high priest. Verse 14 talks about it was expedient for one man to die on behalf of the people. If you'll turn back just a couple chapters to John chapter 11. John chapter 11, verses 49 and 50. This is where they're still conspiring to kill Jesus. Back up to 47. It says, "Therefore the chief priests sent the Pharisees convened a council and were saying, 'What are we doing? For this man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation.'" So here's where Caiaphas comes in. Verse 49, but one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all, nor do you take into account that it is expedient for you that one man die for the people, then the whole nation, and that the whole nation not perish. So he's already had this discussion before, and here he is again over in chapter 18, and we're reminded that he said these things. It's better for one man to perish than for the whole nation to perish. But again, he didn't fully understand the big picture. He didn't understand exactly what was going on. Back there in John chapter 11 is when everything really changed. That's when the Sanhedrin decided that it was time that Jesus had to go, that Jesus needed to die in their mind, in their thoughts. That's when they decided that, when Caiaphas spoke up and said those things. Right before that, Jesus had just raised Lazarus from the dead. These people saw the signs that Jesus was doing, that he raised somebody from the dead, that he was able to do these miraculous things, yet they still had the thought of Jesus needs to be killed. And the Sanhedrin gathered, and Caiaphas made this very point that we just read. He basically said it was better for one man to die than the whole nation to perish. So then we go to Annas' interrogation. So in verse 19, he asked Jesus about his disciples and his teachings, which is exactly what the verse says. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teachings. Jesus very clearly could have not said anything. He has not been private with his teachings. He has not been private in the things that he's telling people. And so the people knew what he had been teaching if they'd been paying any attention at all. But he asks him, what about your disciples and what about your teachings? So in verse 20 and 21, Jesus does answer him and says, Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. Excuse me. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews come together, and I spoke nothing in secret. Why do you question me? Question those who have heard what I spoke to them. They know what I said. So Jesus has been doing all of this publicly. He's been doing all of it out in the open. People are seeing it. They recognize what his teaching is, the signs that he has given, and they know who he is. But yet they are still questioning him and saying, tell me about your disciples. Tell me about your teachings. So right then is where the abuse of the night begins. So if you look in verse 22, it says, when he had said this, one of the officers standing nearby struck Jesus, saying, is that the way you answer the high priest? Jesus answered him, if I have spoken wrongly, testify of the wrong. But if rightfully, why do you strike me? So Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So Jesus said, if I've said anything wrong, tell me. But they didn't say anything. All they did was they sent him on to Caiaphas. So they knew that he had not answered wrongly and that he knew what he was saying, but they were probably still too scared to do anything about it. They still didn't fully understand Jesus and what he was capable of and what he was there for exactly. We talked in class this morning that they had all of those soldiers, they had the whole mob come there because they didn't understand fully what Jesus was capable of if he was going to fight each and every one of them. But Jesus went willingly. But here, they still may not understand exactly what he is capable of and are probably still a little scared of him. The book points out that we don't know exactly where Annas' house was located, but it is possible that the house of Caiaphas was near Annas' house. Some people think that their houses shared a common courtyard. However, recent excavations indicate that the two houses were quite some distance from each other. But regardless, they sent them away from Annas' house over to see Caiaphas. So now we're going to switch over to the Matthew version of this. So Matthew chapter 26, and continue on from there. If you'll read with me verses 57 through 68. It said, those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. But Peter was following him at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and entered in and sat down with the officers to see the outcome. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus so that they might put him to death, but they did not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. But later on 2 came forward and said, "This man stated, 'I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days.' The high priest stood up and said to him, 'Do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?' But Jesus kept silent. And the high priest said to him, 'I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God.' Jesus said to them, 'You have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven.' Then the high priest tore his robes and said, 'He has blasphemed. What further need do we have of witnesses? Behold, you have now heard the blasphemy. What do you think?' They answered, 'He deserves death.' Then they spat in his face and beat him with their fists, and others slapped him and said, 'Prophesy to us, you Christ, who is the one who hit you?'" Jason brought up in class this morning, this is the hard part to read through, to see what they did to Jesus, to see what he endured for us. But it's a very important part just to understand everything that he went through. And it really shows and gives a good testimony of his love and dedication to each and every one of us. So there were quite a few people there. There was quite a gathering while he is here in front of Caiaphas. And they were all trying to find fault with Jesus, as they had been for such a long time already. But they were trying to find things wrong with him. So who did they have come up? They had false witnesses come up and lie about things that Jesus has said or things that he has done, but they were just trying to frame him and trying to give a legitimate reason to be able to put Jesus to death. But they were looking for false testimonies, and in Mark it says that their testimony did not agree or it was inconsistent. Well, that happens when people lie. Things are inconsistent, they don't agree with each other. But they didn't really care. They just wanted to find a reason to be able to frame Jesus and to be able to put him to death. But then 2 men came forward and talked about how Jesus said, "I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days." So Caiaphas, right after this witness comes up and says this, urges Jesus to speak up against the charges that this person is saying that Jesus said. And Jesus remains silent. This isn't the first time that Jesus has remained silent when something has been asked of him, but it's also completely understandable when we read it. Jesus doesn't need to answer. Jesus has already said so much while he is here on earth during his teachings. He doesn't need to answer. They already know the answer to that. But Caiaphas isn't happy with that. He continues on with another attempt, asking Jesus, "Are you the Son of God? Are you claiming to be the Son of God?" Now here again, Jesus could have kept silent because he has already said this. He has already told them exactly who he is and what he is here to do. But he decided to answer. There in verse 64, he says, "You have said it yourself, nevertheless I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." So he gives them an answer. Again, probably not one that they were happy with. He didn't say, "Yes, I'm the Son of God." But he gave them an answer that does answer their question, but not to their satisfaction. But Jesus confirmed that he is the Son of God, and Caiaphas wasn't happy about that. He put on a big show in verse 65. It says that he tore his robes and said, "He has blasphemed." This is just me, but I'm guessing he probably yelled it. He wasn't quiet. He was making a public spectacle of himself for tearing his robes, acting as if Jesus' answer here is some huge travesty. But then Caiaphas doesn't give a ruling right there. This is a really interesting part to me. He doesn't say, "Well, you've said this, so here's your ruling." What does he do? He asks the crowd, verse 66, "What do you think?" And they answered, "He deserves death." So he went along with that, but he himself didn't make that initial judgment. He asked the crowd, "What do you want?" And again, as we know the story, this isn't the first time, or this isn't the last time that they will ask the crowd what the fate of Jesus should be. Then in verses 67 and 68, again, they continue to abuse him. It says they spat in his face and beat him with their fists, and others slapped them. That would be enough, but they kept on going. They kept with the jeering. They were saying, and say, prophesy to us, you Christ, who is the one who hit you? Do you think maybe Jesus knew who hit him? Do you think that it was a mystery to him? He could have said, well, it was, I was about to say George, but it had nothing to do with you. I was thinking of a name. It was this, and this guy. He could have done that, but it wouldn't have mattered. It wouldn't have been prudent. It wouldn't have helped the situation at all. They were just doing it to be rude, to be mean, to inflict pain, and to just have something to do. The trial's not over, but we're going to switch gears really quick over to the denial of Peter. Switch with me back over to John chapter 18. John chapter 18, verses 15 through 18. It says, Simon Peter was following Jesus, and so was another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest, and entered with Jesus into the court of the high priest. But Peter was standing at the door outside, so the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the doorkeeper, and brought Peter in. Then the slave girl who kept the door said to Peter, You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you? He said, I am not. Now the slaves and the officials were standing there, having made a charcoal fire, for it was cold, and they were warming themselves, and Peter was also with them, standing and warming himself. Now before we go too far into this, we're going to read the parallel passage over in Luke chapter 22. So keep your finger there at John 18, but turn to Luke 22, starting in verse 54. Said, but Peter was following at a distance. After they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter was sitting amongst them. And a servant girl, seeing him as he sat in the firelight and looking intently at him, said, This man was with him too. But he denied it, saying, Woman, I do not know him. A little later, another saw him and said, You are one of them too. But Peter said, Man, I am not. After about an hour had passed, another man began to insist, saying, Certainly this man was also with him, for he is a Galilean too. But Peter said, Man, I do not know what you are talking about. And immediately, while he was still speaking, a rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked at Peter, and Peter remembered the word of the Lord, and how he had told him, Before a rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. That's rough. There's so much to go through here, and just how everything ties together and how it affects the story of Jesus. We're just going to look at a couple points. First one being, John is the one that got Peter into the courtyard. Something I hadn't really thought about before studying it more in depth, but when it says in verse 15 back in John chapter 18, Now Simon Peter was following Jesus, and so was another disciple. That other disciple was John. That disciple, says, was known to the high priest and entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. It says, but Peter was standing at the door outside, so the other disciple, John, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the doorkeeper who brought Peter in. So John got Peter into that courtyard where this whole scene unfolds, where this whole scene takes place. So they are there together. So John was known to the high priest. They let him in, and then Peter stood by the gate. But John then went and talked with the gatekeeper and got Peter into the courtyard. But what happened to John when Peter went to warm himself by the courtyard? Since he was known to the household, was he permitted inside the house? And did he sense the danger and leave? Let's think about that for a second. But put yourself in Peter's shoes here. What had just happened? Well, the start of chapter 18, Judas had just betrayed Jesus. Verse 12, Jesus was in front of the priests. He was in front of Annas and then Caiaphas. We hadn't been to Caiaphas yet. He had been to Annas, and then just being questioned by all these people, and they're accusing Jesus of all these things. And he's a little worried. He's worried about what this means for him, what this means for Jesus, but he knows that something good isn't going to, or that something bad is going to happen. Peter had showed courage up to this point, and he wasn't really all that intimidated, but with everything that had just happened, I mean, immediately before this, he was having trouble bringing it all together, understanding it fully, and just understanding everything that had just happened. We get the full story in Luke 22 of Peter denying Jesus. We've got the servant girl by the fire prompting his first denial there. The second one, then Peter withdrew to the gate near the porch, and apparently the servant girl follows him and makes the same accusation, and another servant girl agrees, and he has the same reaction. He has the same answer. He denies it. So, not immediately, but it says after an hour had passed. So some time had passed. He was warming himself. He'd been inside the courtyard, but Peter was alone until another man came up and insisted that he had been with Jesus. The thing that's interesting in verse 59, talking about after an hour had passed, the man said, "Certainly this man was also with him, for he is a Galilean too." How did he know he was a Galilean? He may have seen him with Jesus. He may have known him. The book suggests that it may have been from the way that he talked, the way that he responded to these people, knowing that he was a Galilean. And then in John 18, verse 26, when we talk about the slave whose ear got cut off, it says one of the slaves of the high priest, being a relative of one of those, or of one whose ear Peter cut off, said, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" So Malchus' relative was there and claimed that he saw Jesus with him in the garden. Pretty irrefutable evidence there, but yet he still denies being with Jesus. So there in Luke chapter 22, it talks about his realization as soon as he has denied Jesus 3 times. So we know in verse 60 that the rooster crowed. Jesus had told him that before the rooster crows 3 times, you will deny me. So immediately he recognizes that from what Jesus had told him would happen, realizing what he had done, but it was already too late. Verse 61 is such a powerful verse, the start of that verse. Then the Lord turned and looked at Peter. So they were still within view of each other. As soon as he had denied Jesus, the rooster crowed, and they looked at each other. He knew exactly what he had done in that exact moment. Jesus knew that he had done it as well. And it changed his whole attitude. He wasn't like, "Oh man, I got caught." But what does it say there in verse 62? And he went out and wept bitterly. He was very upset about what he had done. He knew what he had done was wrong. He knew what it meant to deny Jesus. And he knew that Jesus knew that he had denied it, just as he had said. But they locked eyes, and Peter remembered the words that he had said. It's a very, very sobering thought to think about that we'll revisit here in just a minute. But just think about Jesus looking at him as soon as he had denied him. But before we wrap that up, let's go to the third part of the Jewish trial. If you'll stay in Luke chapter 22, starting in verse 66. It says, "When it was day, the council of elders of the people assembled, both chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to their council chambers, saying, 'If you are the Christ, tell us.' But he said to them, 'If I tell you, you will not believe, and if I ask a question, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God.' And they all said, 'Are you the Son of God then?' And he said to them, 'Yes, I am.' Then they said, 'What further need do we have of testimony? For we have heard it ourselves from his own mouth.'" So we know that it's the next day. It's daytime. He's there in front of a council of elders of the people. Right before that, when he had been in front of the Sanhedrin, it was nighttime. And the book says the nighttime session of the Sanhedrin had been irregular, if not illegal. It's kind of done in secret. It was something that they didn't want people to see, but here it is during the day, and so it was time now for a true official meeting. We don't need to turn there, but Mark 15:1 says that the whole crowd was there. And if you think about it, the whole crowd may have included Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, following what Jesus had been doing and what was going to happen, and maybe kind of getting the wheels turning of what needed done once all of this happened. But they had a purpose for this meeting. They had a purpose for this council all coming together. They needed confirmation of the sentence passed on him earlier that night through the irregular or illegal meeting. So they simply asked one question: are you the Christ? But what does Jesus reply? He says, if I tell you, you will not believe, and if I ask a question, you will not answer. It's such a great way for Jesus to answer their questions, as he has done on multiple occasions. He doesn't answer them right away. He gives them an answer, but as per usual, they're not happy with it. They're not thrilled by that answer. So they ask again. Verse 70, and they all said, are you the Son of God then? And he said to them 3 words, all he needed to say, yes, I am. They know that he is claiming to be the Son of God. Those that have been following him and have seen the miracles and the signs that he has done know exactly who he is, but they are trying to catch him and be able to frame him illegally and be able to put him to death. But the Jews had another problem. They knew that they could not put Jesus to death without the Romans. They also knew that the Roman governor would care nothing about the fact that they had claims that Jesus was blaspheming. Luke, just under that, in Luke chapter 23, starting in verse 1, it says, and the whole body of them got up and brought him before Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, we found this man misleading our nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king. So they were coming up with a political reason for Jesus to be punished. They were coming up with, they mentioned that he is saying that he is Christ, a king, but they're also saying that he is misleading the nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, coming up with completely untrue reasons for the Romans to not be happy with him and to be able to give him a judgment that he did not deserve. But they needed to come up with something to be able to accomplish their mission, to be able to do what they were trying to do to Jesus. And we're going to stop there. We know the story, but it's so interesting to read through it all. But we'll continue it next Sunday morning. So make sure you're in class. But we're going to continue on here in class, talking about Jesus before Pilate and then before Herod and everything that he endures through that. But for our application, I want to talk about Peter's denial. Peter recognizing his sin is what I want to talk about. He had the audible cue of the rooster crowing, but then he also shared the look of when Jesus and him looked at each other. So how do we apply that to ourselves today? Well, he remembered his words. He recognized his sin. And so we can turn this into an application for thinking about a few things will happen on the day of judgment. We're all going to try to recognize the sign. The trumpets will sound, and Jesus will come. We're all going to look into the eyes of Jesus and stand before him. We know the words that he has said, that he has given to us, but on that day we will remember his words, and if we have followed them, and we are going to remember every deed that we performed while living on this earth. So what's our reaction going to be? What's our choice going to be? Are we going to go away weeping and sad because we know that we have gone against the words of Jesus? Or are we going to be happy because we have followed the words of Jesus so that we can enter into our eternal abode with God forever? So it really matters what we do, the choices we make, the things we say each and every day. We need to make sure that we're following the words that Jesus has given to us to follow. They're not hard, but they're also not easy. It takes effort. It takes determination to be able to do this. As Gary always said, if being a Christian was easy, everybody would do it. It's not. We go against the world. The world goes against things that Jesus has told us to do. But we make that special effort to do the things that Jesus has told us so that we can be set apart, so that we can be not a part of this world. So the question is, what is your choice today? Are we going to live by the words of Jesus, or are we going to be sad when we hear and meet him? I hope it's the first. I hope that we're all following God's word, that we all are satisfied with the decisions and the life that we have lived. But if you're not, that can change today. That can change this minute. If you will come and ask for prayers, ask for healing, ask for anything that you need, here in just a minute we'll have a chance to do it publicly. If you're not comfortable coming up publicly, please talk to one of us in private. We're here for you and to talk with you and to pray with you and for you. But if we can help you in any way, please come while we stand and sing.